Hey, it's Drummer Daily once again. I'm Daniel Hadaway, and I am so happy that you could join me for another fun few minutes where we talk about drumming stuff. And once again, I am behind my drum kit as I'm recording this for you, which is always a great inspirational place to be to talk about drums, because you never know what might come up as I'm staring at my hi-hat cymbal. So today I actually do want to talk to you about drumming and a concept that has to do with our playing as drummers. Recently I was working with a drummer, and we were able to identify something in his drumming that I realized is something that is a common characteristic of many of our drumming, most of us have this characteristic, however you want to say that. But anyway, a lot of us have this characteristic in our drumming, and I certainly did all the time a few years ago, and then now if I don't pay attention, I'll still exhibit this characteristic some now as well. And the way I want to describe it to you is just by telling you how I became aware of the fact that it existed in me, and maybe you'll kind of see it as well. So it's probably been 8 years ago now or so, my wife and I, we started going to a new church, and at a certain point I got involved with the band, the worship band there at the church. And for those of you who know me from playing drums for All Sons and Daughters, this is actually when I first started playing with David and Leslie in All Sons and Daughters, this came out of that church. So this was right when I first met them and was first playing drums with them at church. And there was a thing where, especially early, we would start, sometimes we'd start a church service with a song that was more upbeat or but kind of sparse maybe in its instrumentation, and it might be an original song, or many times it was a song that of course someone else had written and was already a kind of a popular song. But anyway, this concept kept coming up of, and this especially happened when you'd be doing a rehearsal at 6 in the morning or whatever before church on a Sunday, and you've been up since 4:30 or whatever, and all that stuff, so you're really tired. But this concept was early on, David, I think it was David or maybe it was Leslie, at one point and this came up many weeks, where one of them would say, guys, just because we're trying to keep the volume down or keep it a quiet moment doesn't mean that we can't have the intensity there. And it took me a while to grasp what they meant by that, but eventually I started kind of incorporating that into my playing when I thought it was appropriate more frequently. And the idea is that just because I am striking the drums with not a heavy hit or a hard hit on the drums doesn't mean that in certain musical situations I can't kind of keep that train chugging along underneath the surface, or there's like a storm kind of billowing underneath that quiet volume level. And the opposite was true as well. Sometimes just because there was a moment when something was louder in volume, a bigger moment, it doesn't mean that it had to be intense as far as my playing goes. Just because there's something big and huge doesn't mean that it requires me to really overemphasize all the accents of a pattern or a chord change or a rhythmic element. I don't need to fill up the big moments with 16th notes. I can pull out my best arena rock and like maybe play quarter notes on the ride cymbal and kind of space things out, even though they're big. And so what I started to learn, and the way that shaped my playing, was I started to develop this concept, or this awareness of there's actually two things going on with my drumming from a loudness / intensity perspective. There is dynamics, which of course is how loud my instrument is. How loud am I hitting, or how hard am I hitting the drum, or how loud am I making the drum speak, or the cymbal speak, or whatever it is. And then completely separate from that, and a completely separate conversation, a completely separate thought process, is intensity, which is how aggressively am I accenting a lot of notes. So if there's a real busy guitar part, how many of those, all those guitar notes am I accenting with my drumming? Or how intense am I being? How eager am I in my drumming, as it might be a way of putting it? How busy am I playing? How active am I in reinforcing certain rhythmic elements? And those two things aren't the same thing. I can be active in reinforcing a lot of rhythmic elements, but I can play quietly. Or I can play really loud and I can not reinforce and actively, eagerly reinforce so many notes. So the idea is, I think many of us as drummers think if we are at X volume level, that by default means we are also at X level of intensity. But I want you to start thinking about those two things as separate thoughts, and that one does never necessarily mean the other is present. You can always pick and choose those two things, dynamics and intensity, completely separate. And so what I want to challenge you to do with your drumming as a real practical application of this is, the next time you have a chance to practice, sit down at the drum kit and attempt to do something that is opposite of what you might normally do. So start out by maybe just playing what you would think is a really loud pattern on the drums. But while you're playing that loud pattern, start to think about, all right, is this something that's, from an intensity standpoint, is this really intense? Is it moderately intense? Is it not intense at all? Whatever you decide it is on an intensity level, try to do the opposite, but keep the dynamic, the volume level the same. And if you have trouble identifying what you think the intensity level is, maybe start with a quiet pattern and go there first. So start with something that is a very quiet drum pattern, but say, hey, is this something that's really dialed back on intensity as well? And then start to see if you can amp up the intensity level without actually hitting the drums any harder or any louder, and see if that works. That's just a little quick application tip for this. But yeah, separate your dynamics and your intensity. I think that you'll find some new things to pursue, some new development you can find in your drumming. I think we all can. This is something that I still, like I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I still find myself slipping out of this mindset. If I don't really engage my brain when I'm playing, I will slip back into those two things being unintentionally married together, the dynamics and the intensity. So yeah, focus on your drumming and think about how you can separate those two. Let me know how this works out for you. If you hear this episode and you've tried this and you think, man, this is terrible advice, this didn't work at all for me, let me know. Send me an email, daniel@danielhadaway.com. Or if it did work, or it gave you another idea, or something else happened as a result of you doing this, I'd love to hear all of it. So just send me an email, daniel@danielhadaway.com. Tell me all about it. I read every email. I respond to almost every email, but I certainly will read your feedback if you send it to me. Hey, speaking of feedback, real quick before I go, if you haven't already, I would love if you could leave an honest rating and review, especially on iTunes. If you're listening to this podcast through the podcast app on your phone, or you're listening through iTunes on a computer or whatever, you know what to do, you know how to find it. Go there, and I think you can click the little the info icon on the show notes here inside of the podcast app. But leave an honest rating and review. The more reviews I get, obviously the better the reviews are, it helps too, but the more reviews I get, the more visible my podcast is on all these podcast platforms, and it actually does help me out greatly. The more people that listen, the easier it is for me to keep making these podcasts. And we are, let's see, this is episode number 212. So you are the reason why I've been able to make 212 episodes of this podcast so far. And I want to keep making them for you. So let me know what you think by leaving a review. Or if that's not something you want to do, just send me an email. Let me know what you think about the podcast. I'm always happy to hear from you. All right, thanks for joining me, and we'll talk again really soon. Bye for now.